Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I'll be your host. So today I'm joined with Mark Boggett. How you doing today, Mark?
I'm great. Thanks for bringing me onto the show today.
Yeah, glad to have you here. This is gonna be exciting. I'm getting a lot of requests for this topic, so I'm pretty excited to chat. So for those of you who are not familiar with Mark, tell us a bit about your background.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a career technology investor. Started my life as an analyst in technology, moved into investing in listed technology stocks. And then since 2001, I've been investing as a venture investor in technology. 10 years ago, I specialized into investing into space related technologies. And I formed the world's first ever space fund. And since then, we've been investing exclusively in space. And we are now the most active and prolific investor in the space market globally.
Nice. Is it publicly traded or is it private fund?
So we have both.
Okay.
We have three parts. We have an accelerator, which is global. Then we have a private venture fund, and then we have a growth fund listed on the London stock market called the Seraphim Space Investment Trust. That invests in more mature, later stage private space companies.
So you've been in the space, you've been in, technology for a while. Why did you decide to specialize in space?
Well, looking back at the areas that we'd made money in the past, they were very broad and varied around deep tech, from AI to new materials, a lot of telecommunications type things. And I was looking for an area to thematically focus on, and space really came very much into focus. It's an area that, for a bunch of reasons, has not really had much investment for 20 or so years. It was going through a period of disruption led by SpaceX, and who, through their new rockets, were lowering the cost of access to space. And it was very clear that the technologies that were driving the change were the technologies that I'd been investing in for years. Predominantly AI, but all of the telecommunications and 3D printed technologies that I was familiar with. So this is the reason why we decided, after a year of research and establishing ourselves, to focus on this long-term growth market.
Yeah, it's interesting because I mean everyone wants to invest in SpaceX, but it's private, and according to Elon, if you can believe Elon, it's never going public. So, which I can't blame him, frankly, after the Twitter thing. But you know, one thing that's always been curious to me is how do you invest in space? Like, I think there's an ETF in the US. I forget the symbol, but there's like a space ETF, but I don't know what it's invested in. I don't even know if the companies are invested in space. It's like investing in AI. It's like, well, you have to invest in Google, Microsoft,
Yeah.
or it's like, well, how do you, that's like such a small portion of their revenue that it's just inconsequential. So how do you invest in space? Like, what areas are investable at this point?
Yeah, well, there's a number of ways to do that. One, of course, is to invest directly in listed space companies. Most of those are actually the traditional space companies who are being very challenged in the market at the moment because the private finance venture-backed companies, the type that we're investing into, are really disrupting their market. There's a whole bunch of new space companies, mostly came to the market, started coming to the market during the SPAC boom, and these companies tend to be sort of focused around launch. Then there is the sort of ETF market, which you mentioned, which again doesn't really give you a great exposure to the right part of space that you want to be invested in, the real growth area of space, which are really the private companies. So, in order to get access to the private companies, you can invest either through, there's only one globally listed fund, which I've mentioned already, which is our fund on the London stock market, which is a portfolio of 25 growth stage space companies. All of those are global companies. Some of them have listed since we IPO'd. We've had 5 IPOs. We had one recently, but it's still, those companies stay within the portfolio. And then the other way really is to do that privately, investing through private venture funds. So it's a market really that is relatively new to investors, but so many folks are really interested in the SpaceX story. It's in the news every day of the week. Those that are invested in SpaceX are delighted. With their first investment in space, they hit a bullseye with their first dart. So, I mean, SpaceX is the largest and most liquid private company in the world. So it's very widely held. But a lot of folks are really working now, how else do I get an exposure to this area? Why would I want to get an exposure beyond SpaceX? So this is some of the things that I'd love to cover today to sort of help your audience, think why the market is bigger than just SpaceX. $320 billion valuation today. That's pretty big valuation, but they only represent a part of the market. There's a huge element of space that's still in the very rapid growth phase, and that is being accelerated by defence in the world that we live in today. So there's this massive opportunity that I, for one, am on a crusade to try and help people understand.
So help me understand the different parts. So right, so you've got the launch part, right? You've got, there's different categories that you can
There are,
invest in.
there
Maybe you
are.
can kind of break down the categories so we can
Yeah,
think about
yeah,
it the
I
right way.
will do that. So the three areas are upstream, downstream, and then in space. So the upstream elements are about building satellite, launching satellites, and then constellations of satellites within the space environment that are either around telecommunications or Earth observation. Then you've got the movement of data, the connectivity. Then you've got the analysis of that data. And then you've got products that they use data from space, but they fuse that with other products as well. So like Uber would be a good example of like product company that uses GPS as a core element of their business, but space is not their business. And then you've got all of the other in-space activities. So these are things like space travel, in-space activity, like manufacturing or sort of cell towers. And then you've got activities around the moon and permanent habitation on the moon, and then reaching out to Mars and those type of activities. We call all of that in space. That's not an area that we invest into because the commercial market for those type of activities is many years away and very unclear. Where we're really focused on are the markets where there's a real commercial market today and where really there is a terrestrial customer with a use case and a need and a budget that wants to buy that capability straight away. So we're very much focused on space as its service Earth, but it breaks down in the categories as I described.
Okay, so it sounds like to me, so the in-space category is not really investable at this point. Um, it sounds
That's right.
all that stuff sounds interesting and sci-fi sounds great, but at the same time, it also sounds like people probably want to invest there because they see the potential. But from your perspective, the potential is not really realized. It's like having AGI at this
It's,
point, or it's way
it's
too
quite
far out.
some time away. I mean, there are listed players in this area like Intuitive Machines, which is around lunar landers. You've got Virgin Galactic for space travel. So investors can go and access these areas, but as a specialist in the space market, we're looking sort of closer to home, bigger, nearer, addressable markets. And the biggest of those markets is really defense and climate. Those are the sort of biggest markets that we're sort of playing into today.
Defense, and what was the other one?
Climate and sustainability.
Oh, climate. All right. Well, that's just movement of data, right? I mean,
It's all about the data.
yeah. Okay. So, all right. So the upstream, basically the satellites, that's nothing new. That's been around for a while. I don't know what's different about that. I'd be curious. Let's kind of go through each one. So let's talk through the satellites, the telecom, and all that. That's been around for a
Sure.
while. We've had,
Yeah.
satellite
Yeah.
radio. We've had, Elon's up there with his, I forget the name of it offhand, but
Starlink.
yeah,
Yeah.
Starlink. Yeah. So you've got all these things coming out, but like, what else is there? Is it just that, or like, what's the?
Well, let me give you sort of what I'll do is I'll start off with launch because that
Okay.
really is where the best place to start with the explaining the story. So really for 20 or 30 years, the launch market really didn't innovate. The heydays of huge amounts of government money going into space were sort of long gone. So there was no real innovation, no real desire to innovate in the launch market. So Elon came along and started from a clean sheet of paper and built SpaceX using things like 3D printing and building reusability into the design of the rocket. That completely revolutionized the cost dynamics of launching into space. So that changed the cost of sending a kilo into space from $86,000 to $1,000 a kilo. So, really orders of magnitude change, but it's not just about the cost, it's also about the cadence. So last year there was a launch every 34 hours. Years before, there was a launch once a month. So what's changed is the access to space, both in terms of cost and availability. So that has then led to a revolution in the satellite industry. And they've sort of followed the same path, embracing technologies and capabilities from adjacent sectors and bringing them into the space domain, where satellites that used to be the size of a car or the size of a bus, costing 500 million to $1 billion, satellites with the same level of capability are now being produced for hundreds of thousands of dollars or even low millions of dollars. And these satellites are now smaller. So they're the size of a fridge or a microwave or even a shoebox. But they've got the same sort of level of capability as these historic satellites that were costing hundreds of millions of dollars. So there's been a massive revolution in this industry in recent years. And why does that matter? Well, what happens now is it's cheaper to put up satellites into the space environment. And the satellites themselves are cheaper and smaller, which means you can put up more satellites. So putting larger constellations that travel around the world and gather data and provide communication capability, the more satellites you put into orbit, the more capability it enables. So I'll give you an example of one of our portfolio companies to bring this to a bit of light. We've got a company called ICEYE, it's a European company. They use radar sensors on their satellites. And what they do is they're able to gather information about Earth using radar in 25 centimeter resolution. So with 50 satellites, they can see every square meter of Earth every hour. And through the properties of radar, they're able to look through cloud, they're able to operate day and night and understand the pulse of everything that's going on the planet on an hour by hour basis. And this is then where AI then comes in. We apply AI to that data set to understand how that square meter of Earth has changed during the last hour, the last 5 hours, the last day, week, month, year, and then apply that to different business use cases. So the biggest opportunity at the moment for that kind of capability is in defense. The next biggest opportunity is around climate and sustainability. But then every industry will be looking to use this type of technology. So the change is about the enablement of really large constellations.
When you say climate and sustainability, how does that come into play when you're talking about satellites?
So, well, let me build on the example that I just gave you of ICEYE, that's able to monitor every square meter of Earth every hour. So, what happens in the event of a fire or of a flood or of a tornado? Insurance companies need to understand the impact on assets. So, take for example, during a flood, what they're able to do hour by hour is to map out the perimeter of the flood. They're able to determine the depth of the flood water, the speed of the flood water, and of course, which assets are subject to that flood. So that when it comes to make a claim, they have a record of exactly what went on to that property. So they have a source of truth. So if the claim was that that property was subject to 3 meters of water for 3 days, they can automatically match that against the data set and pay out on the claim. So it means they don't have to send anybody into the field. It means that fraud is much more difficult. It means that the client gets paid out quicker, and ultimately it lowers the cost of insurance and improves the profitability for insurance companies. So there are a myriad of climate-related applications that are using this incredible data set from space to now be able to better monitor the planet and to either make insurance companies more profitable or to save lives. Again, using the example of ISI, the same technology during a flood can be used to identify, a family who are sat on the roof of their building waiting to be rescued. When the flooding has stopped and the various services need to come in to do the cleanup operation, all of the electricity and all of the communications has been knocked down by the flood. They're able to coordinate all of the different departments in order to come in and effectively manage the cleanup operation after a major climate event. So there are just so many ways that this data set is used within a climate environment.
Okay. What's now when you talk about the movement of data, you mentioned things like Uber. How how far along is the technology in using satellites versus using like 5G or 4G, wireless in terms of communicating data? Because satellites
Yeah,
are obviously a lot further up. So where are we with that, in
yeah.
comparison to using a more terrestrial
So this
technology?
takes us back to SpaceX. So Starlink is their broadband in space proposition. They've now got 7,000 satellites in space, and anyone anywhere in the world can now buy a dish in their local electronic store at low cost, and then sign up to get low cost broadband from space. So the cost and the speed of the broadband is competitive to the broadband that you would get terrestrially from your local supplier. But what it does is it provides the many users who are sort of outside of the urban areas that have a really poor service, enables them to get best quality service. So it's really a sort of leveling the playing field for allowing everybody to be able to access the internet, with the right speed at the right time. And this sort of moves out to people in transport, so on trains, on planes, on ship. That I don't know if you've had your own experience of trying to work whilst on the move. It has been terrible up to date, and this is one of the areas that this type of capability now really addresses. So it's here today. This isn't something about the future. This is really now really competitive to the telco industry, and the telco industry is now really having to recognise that there are major new players coming into their market that are really offering a different proposition to customers.
Yeah, I totally understand the people in rural areas and outside of cities having access now, whereas before, they really didn't. And frankly, any excuse to get away from the big telecom companies is a celebration because they have the worst customer service of any company I've ever had, and they don't care.
Yeah, yeah,
Actually, one, I won't name them. There's really two locally, but I I'm convinced that they have a deliberate process uh, of frustrating people because they can't be that bad. Where
yeah.
to me, it seemed like a part of their process was to frustrate people so they go away. It's crazy, but
Well, I
I
guess they've got a local monopoly, haven't they? That
they
they
do.
thought was unassailable. And guess what? Elon has parked his tanks on their drive,
Right.
and they're under pressure. But Elon, got there first. But Jeff Bezos is not far behind. The AWS infrastructure in space is now being launched. So soon as a Amazon Prime member, you're going to be getting sent your dish through the post, and you're then going to be able to access the internet and the cloud through the sky. So this is really happening today. I mean, I'll give you an example of another one of our portfolio companies called AST. They have developed cell towers in space. So they can now connect to any mobile phone without any hardware or software adjustment to that phone and provide 5G telephone service. So this is our best performing ever portfolio company. They're valued at about $18 billion today, second most valuable company after SpaceX. And there's a big gap there between 18 billion and 350 billion. So this is one of the reasons why we see such huge opportunity for the types of companies that we're investing into. And then just to finish off on this one, we've got another company called Skylo. And what they very cleverly do is they leverage all of this legacy telco infrastructure in space and all of the new cell phones that have been brought to market in the last during 2025. They are all now have an antenna that enables them to be able to connect directly to a satellite. So if you've got an Apple phone, you'll already see that when you go out of connectivity, you get a little icon that shows a satellite, and it enables you to be able to connect to the emergency services, even if you're out of cell tower range. What Skylo have done is that they've introduced exactly that for all of the Android phones. So, but they've taken it one step further. What you're now able to do is not only are you able to sort of make a call or reach emergency services when you are out of cell tower reach, but you can also send messages and communicate in ways that you weren't able to before. So that is the old legacy infrastructure that's now being brought to bear to anybody who's got a mobile phone that they bought for this year. So all of this is really sort of upon us right now.
So help me understand you said 5G from satellite. I don't understand because my understanding of 5G was you have to be really close to the tower in order to get 5G signals. And one of the challenges between 4G and 5G is 5G, you have to have a lot of different towers. It's better, but the reach is not as long. So you have to be a lot closer. So how does that work?
Yeah, well, you've just explained the business case for why 5G from space is so important and why our most successful portfolio company, which is still only a handful of years old, is now valued at $18 billion. This is a giant opportunity where the world expects 5G, and we're moving into more and more devices, from IoT. Literally every device that's possible to connect the internet is now being connected. We're moving through to electric vehicles, autonomous drones. The requirements for internet connectivity are just exponentially growing. And then what you stated there was the fact that putting cell towers to address this is really challenged. And does the business case work? Where what we're now exploring is that the business case for space is really now starting to close. And again, it goes back to SpaceX and bringing down the cost of launch. One of the things that's only happened during the course of this week is that SpaceX's new rocket ship called Starship made its ninth successful test flight. So this is a single vehicle. It's the largest rocket ever built. And what they're now able to do once this becomes operational in the very near term is to take 100 tons into space in a single launch. So what that is enabling is the massive build out of infrastructure within the space environment. So this is the reason why the business cases in space are now starting to close, where it genuinely becomes more cost effective to build this infrastructure in space than it does from Earth. And the same is true of data centers. We're expecting the cloud to really start being provided from above the clouds, because at some point the business case is going to close for building these data centers in the space environment. Think about what's involved in a data center: a large amount of land, a large amount of cooling and energy that's required for that, and a large amount of energy for the processing of the data. Well, space is cryogenically cold, no need for cooling. And with the sun and with solar, you've got all of the energy that you need for free. So this is an environment that the market's now focused on for building out infrastructure along these lines. And big announcements those of this week from SpaceX coming to market are stepping stones for this becoming a reality.
So let's talk about one thing I've always been curious about is space trash. Like you've got a lot of stuff floating around up there. Some of it's functional, some of it is not. You've got, certainly, mini asteroids or whatever that come by that they burn up in the atmosphere, but they're certainly out there. How do you handle that? I mean, you're putting up billions of dollars to put something up there and it just gets taken out by something else. What, how does that play into the calculus with people looking at space?
So, space junk is a problem for the future rather than a problem for today. Um, uh, in the history of space, there's only been 18,000 satellites ever launched. Half of those were since 2020. And yet, all of the forecasters believe that there's going to be hundreds of thousands of satellites in space within a decade. So, really, the focus now is to avoid the space junk becoming a problem. So, this is a massive investment opportunity that we have been investing into whilst sort of solving the problem for the future. So, there are a number of elements to it. So, first of all, understanding what's going on in the space environment. So, for example, we invested into a company called Lab that uses ground-based radars to look up into space so that they can see something the size of a penny from 1,000 kilometers away, and then think of that as a piece of debris that they can then monitor in real time, and then bring that into a database and make that database available to the operators of satellites so that they can autonomously move their satellite out of the way of any oncoming danger. So this is an activity that's now underway. Leo Labs, for example, has a more than a 75% market share in low Earth orbit in terms of the number of satellites that they're paid to monitor. And effectively, if you think about that like the Google map of space, knowing where everything is enables you to be able to safely maneuver and safely operate within the space environment. So that's how we sort of deal with the debris that we've got today. Then there's the dealing with the debris that we might create in the future. So historically, the regulation around space debris was that the global space law is that anyone who launches a satellite has 25 years after the end of its economic life to remove that satellite. And typically, the average sort of height that satellites were being positioned, it would on average take 25 years for that satellite to be pulled into the gravitation of the Earth and build up and burn up in the atmosphere. So it's kind of like a fudge, which was absolutely fine when only a few satellites were being launched. But now we're in the era of so many satellites being launched on a daily basis or almost daily basis. The regulation, particularly driven by the US, has now changed. So that in the US, the regulation has changed to 5 years after the end of the economic life of that satellite. So there is now an onus on satellite operators to build in to their design or build into their financing the removal of that satellite at the end of its economic life. So we've been invested into a range of businesses that now provide that service. European company called Deorbit, as the name suggests, is they're like sort of white vans in the space environment that can be paid to go and move a broken satellite and then push it towards the Earth environment so that it burns up in the atmosphere. We've got companies like Astroscale that will offer a range of services. They can go to a broken satellite and clasp onto that satellite and provide more energy so that that satellite can continue its services for longer. Or alternatively, they can remove that satellite from the space environment and they get paid to do that. So ultimately, this is going to be, and already is on the path to becoming, a regulated requirement where those that are launching have the responsibility to remove those satellites afterwards. Of course, they can't do that themselves. So this has led to a growth of a whole new industry, multi-billion-dollar industry, about removing those satellites and keeping the space sustainable for the future of commerce.
What's the What's the probability of, I guess, external, um, meteorites or asteroids, or I don't know the technical term, but
Yeah,
coming through and things that we see that, like you have meteor showers that it's just a light show basically. But what are the
yeah.
probabilities of that impacting the satellites that we have up there?
So the International Space Station is a good example. I'm afraid I've not got committed to memory the exact number here, but it's something in the region of 10 to 20 movements per year that the space station is now taking in order to remove the danger of oncoming debris. The thing about the debris is that once you've mapped where the debris is and how it's moving, you can understand how that debris is going to be moving in days and days ahead. So this is how the operators in the space environment are able to calculate, the risk around being in line with any debris, and then they can sort of move out of the field to ensure that that isn't happening. So that's happening today. But you can imagine as we add more and more activity into the space environment, those they call them conjunctions. The potential of a collision with a piece of debris, they will increase. So this understanding of the data and the environment, and then enabling everyone to sort of work within that is absolutely key. And that's the way that the market is uniformly moving at the moment.
Okay, cool. Um, Now, the one area we didn't talk about, which obviously is a big area, which is defense or offense, depending on which country you're talking about.
Yes.
Um, how does that play into investing? And are there ways to invest, or is it all kind of tied into the three or four defense contractors?
So yeah, there are ways to invest, and again, part of the reason for joining you on your podcast today is to try and help folks really sort of understand this. So first of all, let me just sort of set out how space plays within the defence environment, and then I can talk about different ways of playing that. So there are really four main areas that space relates to defence. The first one is around something called ISR. So that's intelligence, reconnaissance, and security. These are effectively constellations of satellites that look down at Earth so that we can understand what's going on Earth. You can understand how the DoD or other defense organizations need to have that understanding so that they can manage the troops on the ground and strategically manage their effort. Then you've got secure communications. So, for example, the first day of the Ukrainian war, the Russians took out all of the ground-based telecommunications network. So Ukraine, the only form of communication in Ukraine was Starlink, as it is today. So SATCOMs is a really important form of secure communication. Then, of course, you've got GPS, so the navigation capability. This was developed for military purposes. It's now, of course, used by every industry for a myriad of different reasons, but its root lies in defense. And then the final thing is around space-based protection of assets within the space environment, making sure that bad actors can't come and ruin your satellite or spoof the satellite or do something electronic to it so that it no longer works. So those are sort of four areas where space is now involved. And those areas can be played by the primes, and the value of those has shot up during the course of this year. The space element of that is still not really understood by the market. Investors are really educating themselves. So this is the reason why companies that do Earth observation, that provide a service to defence from a constellation of satellites, the market is now starting to understand the value of those. So there are a number of those companies listed. Black Sky is an example. Planet is another example of the types of companies that are able to provide exposure to that kind of sort of defence side of the market. And then, of course, there's funds like ours that really specialise investing into these types of companies that are private, that you can't get access to through the public markets, but these companies will, IPO over the next few years. So I mentioned, we've had 5 IPOs. We've got 3 more in the pipeline, and 2 of those are Earth observation companies. ISI, the one that I mentioned earlier, is one that is ultimately planning to come to the market. This market and market opportunity is growing. So as a consequence, these companies are moving from being private to public. They're raising this additional capital as the IPO to enable them to accelerate the rollout of their constellation, so that they can move from seeing the ground every hour to every half hour to every 15 minutes to every 5 minutes to real time. As these constellations grow and the data gets closer to real time, it has more value to both defense customers, but also all of the other commercial customers that can use this data. Space is dual use. So there's a defense application, but in every case, there is a commercial application as well. And actually, the commercial opportunity is far bigger than defense. But with a $1 trillion budget over in the US, €1 trillion defense budget over in Europe, there's significant amounts of money that are being invested in the space element of defense. And actually, Europe is a massive opportunity because of changes in the funding of NATO and the change of position with regards to the US and how they're willing to fund NATO going forwards. There has been this requirement for Europe to really step up its investment in defense, and particularly its investment in space, because for decades it's very much relied on the US to provide all of this capability. And now Europe is having to stand on its own 2 feet. And that is really one of the biggest opportunities that we're presenting at the moment. The companies, the Earth observation, the communication, the GPS companies that we're investing into, defense is really the big growth customer for the next few years.
Okay. And then, the last category, which we didn't talk about too much, you mentioned was the like in space travel, like looking at like the moon or Mars as potential targets, or some people are talking about mining asteroids. I know that's kind of not in the near term, but I am curious your thoughts on what's going on in that part, and what's the timeline before it becomes really viable.
So there's a new space race that's on, which is being driven by the Artemis Accords, which is really an agreement by a group of nations to get man and woman back onto the moon, largely as a stepping stone for Mars and permanently living off planet. So there is now more resource being put back into space than there has been for decades. But NASA and the space agencies have really learned how to leverage commercial companies to actually do the things that they want them to do. Again, SpaceX is a great example of that. Rather than the US government putting tens and tens of billions to work in developing a new rocket, they effectively provided contracts to new companies, SpaceX being one of them, and then allowed the private markets to finance the needs for that company, but they still get exactly what they require. So the same is happening within the space environment. NASA, for example, has put out big grant budgets for the replacement of the ISS. The International Space Station reaches end of life at the end of the decade. And rather than stumping up the 100 billion or more to replace it with a new version, what they've done is they've put forward billions of dollars in low billions of dollars as contract for private companies to build their own space stations that will then house NASA astronauts to do all of the things that NASA wants to do. The government has got smart in leveraging commercial companies, and that works for the commercial organizations. These are big, long-term, major contracts that are going to grow in value. And as the government customer gets delivery against these contracts, there'll be more and more private customers that want to do that. So we've started off with space stations. So I talked about the IPOs that we've had recently. Our most recent IPO on the New York Stock Exchange about a couple of months ago now was called Voyager, which is the leading private space station company. And again, they were the recipient of a couple of $100 million of NASA funding to really sort of help them finance their pathway becoming a commercial company. Now, the same is happening in space on the moon. So there are government contracts for lunar landers and all of the activities associated with the moon. And again, earlier I referenced intuitive machines. So there are now sort of public companies that are using public market funding to develop the technology necessary to deliver against those government contracts. But the government contracts aren't big enough to sustain these companies going forwards. There then needs to be this private market that will then come afterwards. And the private market can ultimately be huge. Think about all of the real estate development that will be required on the moon. Think about all of the mining and those type of activities that will be required. Think about the infrastructure, the telecommunications, the road networks that will be required when space becomes a, a place of permanent habitation. So this is closer to home. It's the testing ground for doing it further away. And all of this is underway right now. We're still at the very beginning of this journey. But as I said, when we first started talking, from an investment perspective, we really think that there's such a big space opportunity for the here and now. It's $1 trillion market opportunity, providing capability from satellites, data sets, and communication that's required by existing Earth-based customers. That we don't feel the need to look at these new markets that may take many years longer than expected to develop. It's still really very much funded by the whims of governments and can come in and out of fashion. So there's still big question marks about the commercial growth of this part of the market. We're really excited about it. We love the technology. We look at all the companies with great interest, but today we're not investing into them because of the sort of time frame to make a return for investors.
Nice. Well, I really appreciate you coming on the show, Mark. Final thoughts, and where can people find more about you?
Well, final thoughts is, hopefully I've helped people understand that space is much more than just about rocket launches and satellites. These satellites are doing things that are, think about the space as sort of next generation GPS. All of us using GPS every day of the week in a myriad of different ways. And during the course of the next 5 to 10 years, there's just going to be an increasing amount of capability that's going to impact our everyday life. And, space is really at the heart of that, right the way out to energy. And, there's more than 10 companies now that are established to build solar farms in space to bring clean energy back to Earth to help us be less reliable on the black stuff that we can dig out of the ground. So there's a huge play here that's going to be rolled out over decades. So hopefully your listeners have bought into this huge opportunity. It's a data set that AI is really going to be able to really make value of. So when you think about space and you think about data, this is a huge AI play as well. So that's my sort of point that I want people to leave with. And of course, for those that might be interested to get an exposure to this through a fund exposure, where we're able to provide a broad portfolio of private companies which are intended to go public over time. We're on the London stock market. The ticker's SSIT, and it's called the Seraphim Space Investment Trust. So, and there are a myriad of other ways of accessing the market, as we discussed, through direct stock and through ETFs as well. So thanks, Kirk, for having me on the show today. I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk to you and share my views on this exciting market.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I appreciate it. This is a exciting new space. We're in exciting times where all these new trends are coming to pass, and space is one that I get a lot of questions about. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your wisdom with us.
Right. Thanks, Kirk.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money.
Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room. All right. Well, that was a great interview with Mark. Really appreciate him coming on the show. Now we're into the panel portion of the show where we have our very own Phil Weiss. Hey, Phil.
Hey, Kirk. Happy to be here. Looking forward to an interesting conversation.
Yeah, glad to have you. We also have our very own Doug Hagren. Hey, Doug.
Hey Kirk, for those that watch, I'm sure I'm a total stranger at this point. Good to see you again.
Doug's ubiquitous.
Did you just say I'm generic? Wait, no, that's
Wait.
not.
So, Phil, what are some of your thoughts from the interview?
In general, I think this is really interesting stuff to talk about. I don't know that it's something that I would think about investing in because private investing, it's very opaque. There's not a lot of information, not a lot of great access, and investing in it through some type of fund with fees and everything else layered on top of it is just not something I would normally do. But I love to hear people talk about things like this because it permeates so much of our lives. And if I think about some of the things that he said, when he started talking about the use of data and Uber, and we use it too, because when we're driving around and we're using Google Maps or Apple Maps or whatever the map of your choice is, that's getting data from satellites. So I think we just don't think about that. But the one parallel that I found that was kind of interesting was, I used to be a energy analyst, and I'm very familiar with the terms upstream and downstream. In that industry, upstream is basically getting the oil or natural gas out of the ground, right? It moves upstream, it goes from the ground to above. And then downstream is actually when they take it and they refine it and make it into gasoline. And there's so many other products. I mean, oil products are used for gasoline, they're used for plastics, they're used for oil, they're used for even asphalt is the residual stuff that's left when you go through refining. So it was interesting to me to hear that those same terms applied out in space. I just would never have thought of it because I'm thinking about an industry that pulls stuff out of the ground, and here we're up in space and we have the same kind of thing out. You have the same kind of terminology.
Nice. So, Doug, what about you? What are some of your takeaways?
Yeah, Kirk, my big takeaway is that, we're watching, capitalism literally leave the planet. Space is quickly becoming both the next data mine and the next oil field. I think Mark laid it out perfectly. It's not just about rockets anymore. It's about data extraction. Google mined digital behavior, Tesla mines real world driving data, and now satellites are mining the Earth itself. Every farm, ship, storm system, or asset on the planet whoever controls that data controls logistics, they control defense, they control insurance, and eventually markets themselves. And for the investors, it's like the early oil days. This is kind of wildcat investing. It's high cost, very high reward. There will be blood. Reminds from the movie, kind of reminds me of that. Mostly controlled by private hands. A few billionaires, they own the rigs. The rest are just kind of sitting back watching the gusher from the fence line. The investors, they might want in, but most of the profits are really locked away behind private ownership, and the risk, things like debris, regulation, volatility, that's still very public. And I think it's the risk is real. I mean, everyone's talking about mapping, space junk, but they're only tracking, I mean, not really, but mostly refrigerator size degree. Yes, they are trying to get down to, smaller bits, but the true danger, I think, is the microscopic shrapnel. You've got bolts and paint chips that are flying at literally 17,000 miles an hour that can puncture anything in orbit. And it's like drilling, for oil in a field of landmines. Trying to drill for oil in the Korean DMZ, right? One invisible mistake and your billion-dollar satellite is gone. So I think takeaway, I mean, space is a new frontier, but in some ways it's the same old story. Data is oil, access is everything. The real money will go to those who find it, who refine it, who control it before the next crash. And the opportunity, though, is massive. But like with any oil rush, you better know where you're drilling and what's already flying towards you at 17,000 miles an hour.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. So one of the things that I'm curious about is implications, right? Because on Earth we have very more or less known supply and demand. We have known resource deposits for the most part. You can always find more, but we've got this equilibrium in our economies. But once you start getting to space, it just opens up all this new stuff. How is that going to impact, our local economy on Earth if we start going out in space and doing other stuff? What are some of your thoughts, Phil?
Start with it. It's additional opportunity, right? We just don't know how vast the opportunity is. And if I go back to the oil analogy, in which Doug made in a way too, it's also very capital intensive, right? That's the thing that we don't think about in all these industries. There's a lot of capital required to do all this stuff. So the companies that are going to ultimately take the lead, succeed, however you want to put it, are the ones that have the most capital to invest. It's not, this is not cheap to do. I worry sometimes about the societal implications of all this. Like how many these satellites are watching us, and there's all this data that's out there, and there's the ability to see all these things. I mean, what does that mean? And what if that gets into the wrong hands? I don't know. It's just things that I wonder about. And I'm going to be honest, it's not something I've thought about a lot. Listening to Mark makes me think about it a little bit more because just like if we think about from investing, a lot of times we have home country bias, right? So that means we invest where we live. Well, we don't think about space because it's way out there, not a lot's going on. So we may have some bias against investing in that initially until we learn more about it. But right now, I think it's too nascent, and it's just not something that I would want to invest in. But I definitely want to pay attention to what's going on. I mean, I think that's always important for us is to pay attention to what's going on around us and be aware.
Yeah, I agree with that. Doug, what about you? What are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that asteroids may bankrupt commodities. And the part that nobody's pricing in is what happens to global markets when we find out that scarcity might not exist anymore. And we've heard the headlines about asteroids out there with more gold, more diamonds, or platinum than Earth has ever produced. And the moment that one of those is successfully mapped, I mean, we know they're there. We've actually mapped some of them, but they're just so far off in the asteroid belt and places like that, that even before we mine it, the entire psychology of scarcity shifts. Gold doesn't need to be physically dumped into the market to lose value. It just needs to become, theoretically infinite. I mean, that's how markets actually work. It's more, and we've talked about this, Kirk. We like to say kind of, I like to say at least, bonds and fixed income is math, but everything else is emotion. All of this works on belief, not barrels. I mean, remember when synthetic diamonds started hitting the markets? De Beers, literally had to cut prices and reinvent its narrative to preserve diamond demand. At one point, they owned like 90% of the diamond market. I think it's down, and I don't quote me, I've talked about this at another podcast with you, but I think it's down to about 30 some percent that they have now. And they are no longer the influence they used to be. Now imagine De Beers 2.0 in orbit. Private space cartels controlling access to asteroid mines, throttling supply to keep terrestrial markets stable. It's not hard to picture the same handful of billionaires who control launch capacity could soon control the flow of off-world resources. And then they get to decide what enters the market, when, and at what price. That's not just monopoly risk. That's monetary centralization on a cosmic scale. And the ethical question, I think there's some ethical questions coming in this. Who owns space? There is a treaty out there right now. It's called the Outer Space Treaty. It says that no nation may claim it, but it doesn't stop corporations from doing it through proxy. I mean, one company stakes a claim onto an asteroid made of gold, sells futures contracts against it. What happens in the global economies market? What happens to the dollar or to gold as a store of value? We're not talking sci-fi here. I mean, the next logical consequence of private space exploration is very real. We've gone from nations planting flags to corporations writing balance sheets in orbit, and the risk isn't just flooding the markets, it's potentially consolidating economic power into fewer and fewer hands, and this time with zero geopolitical oversight.
Yeah, I mean that's a definite concern for sure. I mean, it's funny. Somebody raised this point a while ago, and I thought it was brilliant, which is, we all think that prices just keep going up. Although, oddly enough, a lot of commodities aren't. I mean, they are from time to time, but some of them are mostly flat. But imagine for the moment that energy was close to free, because that's where technology takes us, where energy gets cheaper and cheaper. Yet the prices
Sounds like
keep,
Tesla,
well, I mean, the
the
prices keep
original
going.
Tesla.
Yeah, the prices keep going up. But if you imagine an energy source that's virtually free, imagine all that can get done. But then imagine what that does for global markets. So in some ways, I almost wonder, like, are all the prices being managed because you're trying to keep an equilibrium? Because it would be highly disruptive, good and bad. But at the same point, we would all benefit from having free energy, assuming it's clean. But if it was that abundant, most likely it would be. So, if we had cheap, clean energy, what would that do to the economies? I don't know. It would be very disruptive, though. So, Phil, give me some thoughts because I know we talked about a lot of areas here in on the interview, but what are some opportunities that you like in space, assuming that we can invest, which of course most of the stuff's private and it's unavailable, but what areas do you think would carry the most opportunity or your favorites?
It's not something that I thought a lot about because I don't, because of the aspect that these are not public, for the most part, these are not public companies. These are private. But the opportunity to explore space and see what else is out there. I mean, I think that's kind of where it starts. I mean, I keep drawing parallels to the oil industry because I think that there's a lot, but they have to find the sources of oil, right? There's a lot of work that goes on. And so we can explore. And like, as Doug said, I mean, if there's resources out there, there could be tremendous economic impacts because energy drives our economy in different ways. I mean, it's not just oil, it's a lot of, right now we have other sources of energy. We have wind, we have solar, we have nuclear seems to be making a comeback. I mean, if you look at that part of the market, there's some nuclear companies that are dealing in nuclear power that are really been doing well over the last year. I mean, forget the Mag 7, they've well outperformed any of those. So there's opportunity out there, but I don't know that I have identified where it is that I would be looking. I just think just the idea of it starts with, I guess, gathering data. Like to me, it's just gathering data that we can use and see what we can do with it. I think that's where I would start.
Okay, cool. What about you, Doug? What are some opportunities you like?
It reminds me a little bit of the gold rush, to kind of tie it back to wildcatting. I mean, when people hear space investing, they think rockets, mining, colonies. I mean, the talk, and let's face it, it's kind of pushed that way, right? Elon talks about going to Mars, which I personally think is the most insane and stupid thing in the world. And he's a very smart individual, but we talk about being able to create an atmosphere on Mars. Mars has a solid core. A solid core means no magnetic field. No magnetic field means every atmosphere you put on it is just going to continue to get blown away like the old one by solar wind. I don't understand this, unless we want to live underground. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But like every gold rush, the real money isn't going to be from the digging. It's going to be made from those that went there and realized how to create retail and capitalism around the miners. The selling of the picks, the selling of shovels, the data that makes the digging possible. So, some of the things that I've kind of done some research on in this is, you could look at space data infrastructure, the new internet backbone. Obviously, satellites are new servers. Every major company, defense, insurance, agriculture, logistics, they're going to rely on that orbital data within a decade. And if you think about Google in 2001, the ones who owned and processed the data stream, they won it. And that's kind of what's happening now with Earth observation and AI and the addition of AI interpretation. So there's some companies out there that are getting into that space. And by the way, Phil, I know you mentioned the Mag 7. The Mag 7 are already in that space. So in a lot of ways, you also have to understand that you already have access to it because a lot of the big players are still public. And so if you're investing in the normal markets, you're kind of played into that. But there's some companies out there like Planet Labs, Black Sky, Maxar, and of course, Boggett talked about, the Seraphim Space Trust. Then you've got, defense and secure communications. Since, it's now a national security domain, I mean, the Ukraine conflict proved, commercial constellations like, Starlink, although, private, are strategic assets. And I think, then you've got defense firms out there that might be able to build anti-jamming tech, encryption, real-time reconnaissance that can scale rapidly as governments outsource capability more. So, again, these are not going to be your small companies. I mean, they could be the Raytheons, the Lockheeds of the world, or it could be someone else coming in that area. Another one I want to get back into is, what I talk about is debris management. There was an article that just came out yesterday that there's something like 17,000 satellites that are in orbit, of which about 8,000 is Starlink. But they're finding that they're re-entering. Their idea is that they've scaled it down to about a 5-year end of life management, and that means that they now have to have obsolescence in every 5 years. But the goal was to have them burn up in reentry. They're actually finding that is not happening. That they're having an extreme amount that are getting through the burn and actually falling back to Earth. They had a couple things just hit, in the Soviet Union, Soviet Union, been a while, Russia. So this is a real issue. So orbital cleanup, satellite refueling, end-of-life management, those are going to be potentially the next utilities. And there's companies out there already trying to do this. Astroscale, ClearSpace, Leo Labs are early leaders. Once regulation hits and mandates, and it will mandate this, it's going to become potentially a recurring revenue industry, a trash collection model. The question is, will it be like investing in utilities, which are not, arguably not the greatest investments? They're known kind of as an income play. Or are they going to be the waste managements of the world that continues to just kind of skyrocket in its valuation? A couple other areas, ground systems, edge computing. So you're going to have to build ground stations, you have to build antennas, more AI, through edge AI processors. That's going to be able to connect space to the cloud, and that's a bridge where risk can actually be lower and cash flow is real. In the world of insurance, risk analytics, and the establishment of space ETFs, orbital activity rises, so does risk. So you're going to see companies that are going to do space insurance. Hopefully they do hopefully this is going to be more like the companies that figure that out and not the long-term care companies that, if you go read on them, did a really bad job with their actuarial tables and are now paying the price for that. There's going to have to be some real solid risk modeling, and risk modeling firms that come in there. And again, there are some ETFs that are trying to play in these places. Like Kathy Wood's ARK investment. They've had a lot of volatility. It's certainly not, they're very clear. Don't invest in this if you have, if you are skittish, and if you've ever watched any of those ETFs, they have flown, but they've also crashed, kind of like those satellites in reentry. So you need to be, be aware that like anything, I mean, look how long Nvidia was nothing and volatile until it blew up. Like anything, some are going to make it, some will be the Amazons, some will be the buy.coms. I certainly wouldn't go and centralize your investment strategy on this unless you have an extreme risk tolerance. But active investors are going to maybe want to look for a diversified exposure. They're going to want to watch who's selling the data, not just who's watching the rockets. You want to make sure that you chase the rails, the data rails, the defense rails, the infrastructure that makes the rest of it possible.
Yeah, I think it's a good analysis, Doug. Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing you said, creating atmosphere on Mars is stupid. I don't think Elon's creating an atmosphere on Mars. I think his companies, if you think about the funny thing about Elon is he operates like 5 levels above everybody else. So like what he says, most people don't pick up on, but occasionally he lets some nuggets slip. But if you think about all his companies, he's got electric vehicles, he's got satellite, he's got the Boring Company, right? And if you think of all the things you'd need to operate on another planet, it would be the companies he has. He's got battery technology. You think of the Boring Company. You think we're gonna be walking around the surface of Mars? No, we'll be under the surface of Mars. I mean, look at Total Recall. I mean, that's a perfect example of what works, right? Because we like to live in the movies. But if you think about it, like
And
if
they
we're on
come true a
Mars,
lot. So scary enough.
yeah, we won't get down that rabbit hole. I got to go reach my tinfoil hat if you want me to talk about that, Doug. Um, but in all seriousness, I mean, if you think about what we would need for Mars, we would need electric vehicles, we would need battery technology, we would need a boring company to tunnel under the surface, and we need to get there. I mean, what I find interesting is all of the technologies that we need to get there. There are so many different layers, right? And if you think about what we have now and what we're focused on, I mean, you need to build a, an orbital platform, if you will, in order to even get out there. If you think about what you're going to need to get out of our orbit, or get out of our atmosphere into the orbit, and then from there get into Mars. Like we've got some big challenges. One of which is propulsion, which we haven't solved yet. But there are a lot of problems. Nuclear is another one. Like how are you going to get energy to get out there? So all these things are solvable, but you have to get them in stages. So if we're going to get to Mars, that's going to take a while to get through all these different layers of tech. I will say that one of the challenges that we've talked about, that everyone here has talked about, is the lack of opportunity to invest in publicly traded companies. Now I know there are some ETFs, but what are they invested in? Defense contractors, right? It's kind of like investing in AI, but you can only invest in like the public companies that are invested in AI, and those are like the Mag 7. So you're really not getting any alpha by doing that. And for the most part, there are some companies that you can invest in that are mostly space, but they're smaller. So you really have to do your homework. So I think one of the challenges is how do you invest in space? Well, it's really hard to. And you can invest in SpaceX as an example, but that's a private company. You can invest in private companies, but now you got to find somebody who's selling. And I think Elon said he's never bringing SpaceX public, and I can't blame him. Who wants to bring a company public nowadays? There's so much scrutiny that goes into it that if you're running the company, why would you even bother? He doesn't need the money, obviously. So I think these are just questions that have to be thought about if you're going to invest in space. But I think ideally there's a lot of opportunity, but we all need to keep in mind that how do you invest, and does it even make sense, or do you just go find something else? Just because there's a shiny object doesn't mean you need to invest in it. So we're gonna wrap it up here. So final thoughts, Phil.
So as both of you are talking, there's one thing that think about is back in the 90s when we had the internet and you were looking at companies to invest in. There was a old book called, there were two books that come to mind. One was The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. And in that book, he talked about the idea that usually when a new technology comes, whoever was the leader before is unlikely to be the leader when that technology comes to fruition, because that company spends so much time trying to build and defend its turf, so to speak, that it's hard for it to go into those new areas. And that's a lot of times why companies spin off these smaller pieces because they can be more successful on their own. So the odds of it being a defense contractor seem low because they have so many other things that they're doing that it's hard for them to really devote the time and resources to make that successful. And then the other thing was there was another book called The Guerrilla Game that came out around that time, and it talked about the idea that when you want to invest in something like this, think about taking a basket approach. We have said that there's not a lot of companies, but ideally, if you're going to invest, since you don't know which one's going to be the one that's successful, you want to try to invest in a basket of them because if there's that one that really is truly successful, the gains from that company are likely to outstrip any losses that you have from the ones that aren't. So that's just a couple of things to think about as you're going through this. But you know, like I said up front, this is not an area that I've spent a lot of time with from an investing standpoint. I think it's really interesting, though. It's definitely something to keep an eye on and to watch because it can have a lot of impact on our world as we go forward. I'm Phil Weiss. My firm's Apprise Wealth Management. I know experiencing big life transitions can be stressful. My job is to help empower women facing new beginnings with the financial knowledge and tools they need to make self-assured decisions. As I said, my firm's Apprise Wealth Management. We'd love to get to know you. You can visit our website at apprisewealth.com. That's APPRISE wealth.com. And you can read our blog or sign up for our weekly newsletter. Thanks for having me on today, Kirk.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Phil. And Doug, final thoughts from you.
Yeah, Kirk, I want to just touch base on it. You're absolutely correct, and I wasn't very clear about it. I don't think Musk is an idiot when it comes to Mars. And I know that a lot of what he's talking about, making Mars self-sustaining is yes, he's talked about potentially taking their atmosphere, subsurface ice, turning into oxygen, water, methane, etc. More radical ideas he's floated, like thermonuclear devices over Martian poles to vaporize the ice caps. All of this, you're right. He throws a lot of things out there, and as I said, I think underground is where things are going to be. The challenges of actually engineering Mars almost impossible. Nuke the poles is a highly theoretical, controversial, and it faces serious energy, environmental and ethics constraints. Of course, if they find that asteroid with all the energy, I guess then you can make that happen. If we can figure out how to create fusion that's going to be sustainable, maybe there's an opportunity. But as you said, there's really nothing credible about him, actually talking about full terraforming. Musk and SpaceX, X are producing roadmaps towards infrastructure, habitats, things like that. They're not, not necessarily a fully rebuilt atmosphere, but at the same time, he throws these things out because you're right. He has designed a company that will allow, basically, as you said, will allow us to be able to survive in those environments, whether it's with humans or totally automated, in order to be able to expand, the human race beyond the borders of our planet, which is very fascinating. He's a huge visionary, and so ultimately, I mean, although he talks about rebuilding atmosphere on Mars, literally creating this ecosystem from scratch, it's very visionary, no question. But the reality is, here on Earth, most families, they can't even rebuild their own financial atmosphere after one bad market cycle or tax mistake. And so that's where smart income planning comes in, because while some dream about terraforming Mars, smart money families are busy terraforming their balance sheets. They're building systems that generate income, they adapt to change, and they manage risk the way smart capital does, with discipline, data, and defense. At mergentadvisors.net, that's MERGENT, mergentadvisors.net. We have a new website, by the way. Go out and check it out. We also have mergentadvisors.com. We have integrated those, but we help affluent families structure income that lasts, income that's protected from taxes, inflation, and volatility. Because the wealthy, they don't chase returns, they engineer outcomes. So whether it's retirement income or the astronomical cost of college funding, which, by the way, you need to do your research on, that we're already seeing impacts of the one big beautiful bill on potentially future costs to college and how you're going to fund it. The principle is the same. You just can't react to the markets. You need a plan that survives them. So before you build your future in orbit, make sure your financial atmosphere here on Earth can sustain life. Smart money families don't guess, they plan. So visit mergentadvisors.net, again, MERGENT Gent, or mergentcollegeadvisors.com, and start building a strategy that's as intelligent and resilient as the future that you're working for.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on, Doug. And I know Doug presented the idea of nuking the poles, and I love people's ideas of grandiose ideas. Let's just nuke the poles and see what happens. Well, isn't that why all the aliens are gone? Because they already did that. Anyway,
I didn't present it. Musk did. So.
Yeah, I know. Well, I got my tinfoil hat on for you audio viewers. A lot of theories floating around out there, so it's I'll be fascinated to see what actually comes of space. That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us on Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, wealth manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com, and of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.